Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to you all. It's my absolute delight to welcome Rosalind Gill, Professor of Cultural and Social Analysis at City University London, as a distinguished visitor to the University of Auckland. And I thank the University and the School of Psychology for supporting her visit. Rosalind Gill is one of those scholars whose work you immediately admire, and indeed possibly envy, although I'm not sure we're supposed to admit such things, for its insight, its breadth, its depth, and its clarity, and its relevance to contemporary life. With an interdisciplinary background in sociology and psychology, Rosalind received her PhD in social psychology at Loughborough University. I did my PhD there a few years after she did and was very disappointed to not be crossing paths with her at the time. She has gone on to work across a number of disciplines, including sociology, gender studies, and media and communications, and is, according to her Wikipedia page, a cultural theorist, a feminist, and a media commentator. She's well known for her research and scholarship across a broad range of areas: gender and media, cultural and creative work, the conditions and experiences of labour, including of academic life, discrimination and inequality, subjectivity and neoliberalism, mediated intimacy, and I could keep going on, but I'm giving Ros space to talk herself. For the last decade, she has made significant contribution to debates about the sexualisation of culture, and for thinking through the complex and shifting relationships between the out there of culture and the in here of subjectivity and identity and desire and practice for individuals. She writes in a delightful and accessible manner, and if you haven't already, I would encourage you to look up her work. Some of her already published books include Theorising Cultural Work, Labour, Continuity and Change in the Creative Industries, published by Routledge, New Femininities, Post-Feminism, Neoliberalism and Subjectivity, published by Palgrave Macmillan, Secrecy and Silence in the Research Process, Feminist Reflections, also by Routledge, and Gender in the Media by Polity. In the near future, we'll see new books on gender and creative labour and mediated intimacy. Tonight, she'll be talking about her work related to that latter topic, a collaborative UK study on the broad area of sexting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ginny, for such a wonderful and generous introduction. It is a great honour and a great privilege to be here. It's so delightful to see so many of you on such a beautiful evening when, you know, other things would surely be calling to you. Well, they would be to me in this gorgeous city. I want to sort of start off with some thank yous. First of all, to the University of Auckland generally for inviting me. It's a great honour to be here as a distinguished visitor. I've put on my slide the Department of Psychology. That's just, I'm sorry, that's just a UKism. I meant to say School of Psychology. I very much appreciate the invitation, and particularly want to say thank you to the Psychology and Social Issues group, many of whom I've had the chance to meet over the last couple of days. And especially I'd like to thank Nicola Gavey, Ginny Braun, Margie Wetherall and Paulette Benton-Grieg for all the work that they've done in kind of facilitating this visit and making it possible. I'm sure I've missed out key people in that list, and for that I apologise, but I just really want you to know that I appreciate this. It's great to be here. And I also wanted to thank the people that I did this research that I'm going to be talking about today. It's the kind of research that you just couldn't have done on your own. It's kind of been harrowing and challenging in lots of different ways, doing this research around sexting. And my collaborators on the project are Jessica Ringrose, Laura Harvey, and Sonia Livingstone, and I'd like to thank them. But more broadly, one never works in a vacuum, and you know, we're all, as academics, as scholars, as activists, we're all constantly being influenced and informing each other's practice. And I really wanted to highlight the Sexual Politics Now website that's come out of the Marsden grant that's taking place in the School of Psychology here. It's such a fascinating project. It's such important work, and it very much the kinds of themes around gender, power, pornification, sexual politics more generally, very much kind of feed into this work that I'll be talking about tonight. I'm not going to give the kind of talk where it's kind of laden with references and people's names. It's not going to be that kind of talk, but I wanted to kind of direct you to that website at the outset because it has been so informative very broadly of this project. So without further ado, let me get on with it. So wanted to say something really by way of context about why we started to do this research and just the general sense of concern, anxiety, even moral panics that there were around sexting when we did this research. It's now 2 years old, and I think that it's already dated. I think you'll notice when I start talking about some of the social media platforms that I talk about, that they're not even the social media platforms that are current today. You know, it's kind of moved on from BlackBerry Messenger, which a lot of the young people that we talk to were, you know, absolutely kind of living through, and it's much more around Instagram and Snapchat now. So it is dated, and for that I apologize. But it seems as if every new wave of technology, every new social media platform that comes along throws up new challenges and new questions and new anxieties. And I think that you know, there's always this sense that there are challenges that previous generations just haven't faced. And all those questions about how can we support young people, and indeed all people, because this doesn't just affect young people. How can we support people to deal with these new technologies, these new media, these new practices, which generate new ethical, political, social, personal dilemmas? And our starting point was in kind of reflecting on all the panics that we saw in the British media in particular, was just to notice how absent young people's voices were from, you know, it was kind of this sense of great concern about new technologies, but nobody seemed to be actually talking with young people and listening to their concerns. And we also noticed the way that sexting as a set of practices always seemed to be lifted out of social life, as if it was this kind of completely new, unique phenomenon that had no connection to anything that had gone before or to any other social practices. And we wanted to challenge that in the research. And I've put down here in, you know, scare quotes, parental advisory. And that is because there's some kind of hard stuff in this talk. There's some really challenging things to deal with. We certainly found it very challenging doing the research. What I found when I've presented this before is that for many young people in the audience, it's completely familiar, it's completely banal, it's completely and utterly recognizable. But for older people, it's quite shocking. And that's why I've kind of inverted the normal parental advisory, which is, of course, for parents about young people, and say, actually, it's the other way round that the health warning should go. So what is sexting? What is it that we're researching? Well, it's been conventionally defined as an exchange of sexual messages or images, the creating, sharing and forwarding of sexually suggestive nude or nearly nude images through mobile phones and the internet. As I've just mentioned, it's given rise to widespread public concern regarding the potential risks that digital technology may pose to young people, which range from kind of general worries about early exposure to sexual content or pornographic content, to concerns about sexual grooming by adult strangers, to concerns about cyberbullying, to concerns about sexual harassment. And the fact that some sexting images fall foul of pornography laws has amplified public anxieties about the sexualization of childhood and girlhood in particular. And I think one of the unfortunate consequences of that is that it's ended up criminalizing a lot of young people who are actually involved in consensual or exploratory sexual communication. And that kind of, the way that it plays into the criminal justice system tends to kind of ride roughshod over all the subtleties and nuances of adolescent sexual negotiations. One of the key themes in the kind of criminal justice and in the pedagogic responses centres around a narrative of teenage girls at risk and in need of the criminal justice system to regulate their sexuality. And the media has tended to pick up on this. It's tended to dramatise that theme of underage female risk with extreme stories of sexting gone wrong. The tragic and almost kind of iconic case of Amanda Todd in Canada, where an image of her breasts was circulated without her consent, which was then connected to years of cyberbullying that ultimately ended in her suicide, has become a kind of exemplar of what sexting is and what can go wrong. Tragic though such cases are, they are thankfully extremely rare. But I think what's striking is the way that this discourse of girls at risk has come to shape the policy agendas. And one of the underlying messages seems to be a kind of victim blaming in which the subject of the photograph becomes responsible through their own lack of vigilance for their subsequent demise. And I think it's striking how little of the policy and the public safety responses address boys and young men. So into this context, our very, very small scale, very humble, very modest qualitative study was designed to respond to and enhance our understandings of the complex nature of sexting and the role of mobile technologies within peer networks. It was designed to be a pilot study. It was designed to be very small scale and to be an exploratory study of something whose scale and dimensions were unknown. We were guided by some key principles in carrying out the study. A desire to listen to young people without judgment and to hear about their own experiences, practices, and understandings of the broad phenomenon of sexting. An absolute belief in the right of young people to be sexual subjects and a refusal of moral panics around youthful sexuality. A feminist analysis that's also attentive to issues of class, race, and ethnicity, and also heteronormativity, though it's such a small study that it's not really been able to include significant LGBTQ participants. And with that, a refusal to accept the widespread discourses of blaming of young women for sexting gone wrong, either depicting them as naive victims or as knowing and manipulative and somehow slutty. So what we did was conducted focus group interviews with only 35 young people in Year 8 and Year 10 in 2 inner city London schools. Now, Year 8, just to translate, is it's 12 to 13. Year 10 is 14 to 15. So in the UK system, we start school at age 4 and we go through to 18, and we just have one break in our schooling. So that break is at 11. So our Year 8 group are in the second year of high school. So they've been, they've been in high school for just over a year. We have a very mixed sample. It's got very high levels of deprivation. It's got high proportions of black and minority ethnic students. And the schools were also diverse in themselves. So there were two schools, one was in North London, the other in South London. They had different kinds of e-safety policies. They had different attitudes towards surveillance. So for example, in one of the schools, it was completely cameraed up. Everywhere had cameras, apart from the bathrooms, and that was an issue. In the other school, they had a much more kind of softly approach to their surveillance. They had different approaches to whether or not young people were able to access computers in school to look at Facebook accounts and so on. So we carried out 35 group interviews with 35 young people, and we also asked if we could friend them on their various social media sites. And so we mapped some of their activities online, and then we returned to the schools and we did 22 individual interviews with selected young people. And we also interviewed some staff and teachers at the school. So what we've found is that we want to move away from the two dominant paradigms through which sexting is generally discussed, either in terms of kind of generalized sexualization of culture or in terms of risks to children and young people from predatory strangers. We didn't find either of those frameworks helpful at all in understanding young people's experiences. And in fact, one of the top headlines from the study is what we want to say back to internet and e-safety campaigns. For example, we want to say to them, you need to move away from this constant focus on stranger danger. That's not where it's at. The young people in our study said that they'd had e-safety lessons since they were tiny, and they'd really got that message about stranger danger. They didn't want to hear any more about paedophiles or about not giving out their address online and things like that. What they really did want was some help and some opportunity to talk about difficulties amongst the peer group, because they had no one to talk to about that. Their parents' generation hadn't had that experience of living their lives online as well as offline, and teachers weren't seen as a safe group that they could speak to about those kinds of things. And they very much communicated to us, we really need some spaces where we can talk about this stuff. And I think that's partly why there was such alacrity and enthusiasm to actually participate in the research. So if we moved away from those two kind of dominant paradigms, it doesn't then mean, okay, no problem, we're completely sanguine about this. On the contrary, we did reveal real problems as experienced by young people, but we would distinguish these from the kind of headline moral panics in the popular press. One of the things that we found is that there's a great diversity of experiences, that we can't even say that sexting is one thing. It's not a singular phenomenon. It can't also be described in absolute terms. We can't sort of say it's wanted versus unwanted activity, it's deliberate versus accidental exposure, because most of the young people's engagement with sexual messages and images lay in a kind of grey zone. Few of the teenagers wanted to be excluded from the sexual banter, the gossip, the discussion, the flirtation, the dating activity that was endemic to digital youth culture. But then to take part, so they didn't want to be excluded from that, but then to take part is also to be under pressure, to look right, to perform, to compete, to judge, to be judged. So most of the young people's talk reflected an experience that we would characterize as pressurized yet voluntary. Yes, they choose to participate, but in a context where they can't really say no without being excluded from all the major aspects of social life. And we also would argue that because sexting's not just an individual practice, its effects aren't limited to the people engaged in some specific act, it actually permeates and influences the whole peer network in multiple ways. So to be a teenager today, whether or not you ever send somebody a sexy selfie or the like, is to be kind of implicated in a culture of sexting. And what we want to argue really is that this culture is also deeply and profoundly sexist in ways that haven't really been explored in much research, or crucially haven't really been taken seriously by policymakers. Moving on, the structure of the talk, of the remainder of it, we want to start off by just talking about the importance of mobile technologies in young people's lives and then move through this. So mobile technologies, and in particular smartphones, suffuse the everyday lives of young people, structuring and shaping their experiences. Mobiles are a constant from waking up in the morning to going to sleep at night. This is a group of 14 to 15-year-old girls. So how much are you using your mobile, do you think, in an average day? Like all the time? I use it to wake myself up, then I use it to phone Riley or you to see where you are, to meet each other in the morning. Then when I get on the way to school, I'll be texting people from school. Yeah, and using it to get the time. Yeah, to get the time. I use my phone every second of the day. If I'm not using it, I feel a bit weird. I use it to go to sleep with my music on. I talk on my phone all day long. I think this sort of just captures something about the profound affective bonds that people have with their mobile technologies. These technologies are loved and felt to be central to life and to young people's sense of self. In fact, life could be unthinkable without the phone. As one girl put it, I would die without my BlackBerry. Another told us, I can't put the phone down. People are sending stuff every minute. You just keep looking at the phone. You can't put it down. So these phones were incredibly popular. They, particularly at the time we did the research, BlackBerry was really kind of permeating adolescent groups. It's since kind of collapsed for that sector, I think. But the thing that was appealing about that was the free messaging services, which are now obviously offered on other platforms as well. And they were used to constitute huge peer networks of communication, which were completely overtaking conventional texting like SMS, and also far overtaking Facebook in our sample. And it was often favoured to use BlackBerry Messenger over other forms of communication because it wasn't surveilled by adults. So there was the sense that your teachers are probably on Facebook, your parents are probably checking out on Facebook. Of course, people did have that thing where they had multiple accounts, the one that they showed their parents and then their other one that their friends interacted with. But generally speaking, they'd kind of moved on to BlackBerry Messenger as a way to avoid that kind of adult surveillance. As Mercedes put it, with your BlackBerry light, with my phone, like my parents don't really check my phone, yeah? That's why most people hide their stuff in their BlackBerry. But on Facebook, yeah, like it's normal for your parents, your family to have Facebook, they will check it. This was expressed to us repeatedly. And someone said, Facebook? No, everyone calls Facebook Baitbook because you can see what's going on it and people can do screenshots and then, you know, pass it on. The teen dominance of BlackBerry Messenger at the time also seemed to make adults feel that it was a safe zone, safer than other social media where strangers might be a threat. And we found that these kinds of technologies were dramatically reshaping modes of communication, intimacy, romantic attachments. So talking on the phone and even texting seemed to have been overtaken by messaging. As Monique explained, even like when you're going out, yeah, and this boy phones me and he's like, you're nice, whatever. And then the first thing they ask for, they don't ask for your number anymore. They go, oh, you've got BB. And then they go, give me your BB pin. And from there, you just talk on BB. And she goes on to explain that. And somebody else says, BBM is like Match.com, basically. You've got everyone there. And it's like people send broadcasts over BBM. There'll be a smiley face, and next to that, something like, would you have sex with me? Would you do this? Would you do that? And it wasn't just individual communications. So the broadcast, where whole groups of people, multiple groups would be sent stuff, was hugely significant, and it was often organised around sexual questions or banter. And this is a typical one. Like the question will be like, would you have sex with me? Lights on, lights off, socks on, socks off. I don't know if that's very peculiarly British or something. What position, to what song, condom, no condom, stuff like that. It's like, so you think it's quite common. When I first got my BlackBerry, everyone was sending them like, and I was like, wow, you get broadcast after broadcast after broadcast. So I started telling everyone, just untick me, I'm getting annoyed. So I've just tried to convey in this first part just something about how important these smartphones and the kinds of communications that they facilitate, how incredibly important they are in young people's lives. And it hardly needs saying, because that's what life is now, isn't it? That you're never without that kind of constant pinging of messages coming in. But now I want to move on to talking about the importance of gender, because one of the key findings of the research is about the extent to which gendered power relations are saturating young people's lives. And no understanding of sexting would be complete without an appreciation of the extent to which a completely normalised sexism constitutes the context for all relationships, both on and offline. And as researchers going into schools, we were distressed by the levels of sexist abuse and physical harassment, even violence, that girls were subject to on a regular basis. And we were struck by the way that it's entirely taken for granted by both the girls and the boys, even when the same behaviours would be grounds for dismissal if they happened in a workplace, would be grounds for arrest and prosecution if they happened on the street. But these same kinds of behaviours were completely normalised and taken for granted within the schools. And I want to kind of move on to what I consider to be the most kind of harrowing part of the talk, which is about this normalised sexism. And you can't really understand the other practices without understanding the taken for granted idea that girls and young women's bodies are somehow the property of boys and young men. This took on a very vivid form in one of the most common practices of sexting, in which boys solicited and girls sent photographic images of themselves or parts of themselves, in which a boy's name had been written over the woman's body in a black marker pen. A typical example would be a sort of cleavage shot, either naked or in a bikini or a bra, with the breasts squeezed together, and then the girl would write, you know, Paul owns me or Jason owns me across that, and having that writing is absolutely integral to the sending of the picture. It's not just to have the picture, it's to have that picture with that attribution on it. But this is part of a more general sense of boys owning girls' bodies. So this is Kamal, who's a 12-year-old young man, just telling us, well, like, say I got a girlfriend, I'd ask her to write my name on her breast and then send it to me, then I'd upload it onto Facebook or Bebo or something like that. But like, some people would say who it is and some people won't. There was a very interesting sort of localized ethics around whether or not you kind of outed or exposed the person, because often they were, the shots were cut off here, so the person wouldn't necessarily be recognisable. And boys had this sort of sense of making, you know, careful ethical judgments about whether or not they would say who the girl was. Okay, so like, are you going out with someone at the moment? Yeah. And have you got pictures of her like that? Yeah. But it only makes sense because it rests on the assumption that girls' bodies are for men and boys. And in dating relationships, boys expressed a really powerful sense of propriety over girls' bodies, including kind of dictating what they wore. And I don't think I've got time to read out the quote that I wanted to read out, but the sense of a sort of homosocial community of boys where the woman's significance is really about the relationship between the men and the status between the men. So girls saying that boys tried to police the way that they dressed because they needed to do that for their mates, their male friends. And girls often felt kind of annoyed about that. You know, why does he tell me I can't wear a short skirt? I'll wear what I like. But also at the same time, they often felt kind of quite pleased and quite proud that, oh, it shows that he cares, that he's, you know, he cares enough to police what I wear. Also, there was, you know, widespread harassment of girls, and girls have adapted to this form of harassment by adopting practices like wearing shorts under skirts or even refusing to wear skirts. Girls in year 10 talked about a daily experience of harassment. Yeah, I got harassed like nearly every single day. Not sexual harassment, like seriously, but then they do stuff like, oh, look at her bum, look at her breasts. Yeah, they do still shout some things out. Yeah, at least now they're shouting it out. Before, they'd like run past you and slap your bum and that. Yeah, year 9, and they used to do that thing. Do you remember? Do you remember we were standing, yeah? Say you were standing talking to your friends. A boy will come over and they'll put their leg around your front leg and they'll push you over, and then they do that. Yeah, you just go flying. You'd go flying on the floor, and then if they were really that bad, they'll jump on you, like we all used to run from the boys. So what this shows, and this is one of so many quotes that I could have read out for you, is just how quickly verbal harassment can quickly tip over into physical violence, such as being deliberately tripped up, pushed down, as these girls describe. It was a very common experience that usually involved boys, or a boy or boys, groping or daggering, which is kind of like dry humping a girl once she was down. Verbal harassment also wasn't just about repeated comments about girls' bodies, but also being repeatedly asked to perform sexual acts on or for boys. And this is one area of the young people's lives that's been significantly intensified through mobile technologies. So girls talked about being asked for beats, which is intercourse, or head, or blows, by what they called random people in the school and the street. So Monique here explained her annoyed and mystified reaction to constantly being asked to masturbate boys or allow them to ejaculate over her face. Boys say stuff like, "Can I butt in your face?" And you just like, "Can you do what? What do you mean?" And they're like, "Yeah, can I butt in your eye?" No, why would I even, who's going to sit there in their right mind and say, "Yeah, go ahead, ejaculate in my eye"? What could that help? Like, that is not even normal, like seriously. But I've sat down with a boy and said, I need to literally understand what you guys get out of porn. I've actually sat down with a boy and said, put it on, let's watch it, yeah. Monique was just absolutely awesome. An incredible 15-year-old. So for some girls, the constant verbal harassment was less of a problem than the physical abuse, such as the routine experience of being touched up, felt up, groped. This was an endemic problem for the girls in both the schools, which they told us happened all the time. Yeah, like boys touching us up and stuff. Yes, and does that happen a lot? Yeah. Well, it practically happens every day. So they're trying to touch your boobs? No, no, your bum. I saw some boy yesterday on Facebook was trying to say he owns my bum. I saw him today and I shouted at him. Another aspect was what they called rushing, being pushed down or being daggered. So frequently touching up went well beyond just the groping of breasts, bottoms, genitals, but involved being pushed down by a group of boys and enduring them daggering you, that is thrusting against you, usually in the school corridor. And we heard so many accounts of girls being pushed over and subjected to this. It sounded to us like criminal assault. It sounded like a violent crime that would be prosecutable if it happened in the street or in another public space, but was just kind of routinized in the school. And I mentioned to you before that one of the schools had ubiquitous cameras, and so you're probably thinking, well, how did this happen? You know, why wasn't somebody coming then if it was all being filmed? And basically, there was just intense pressure on the girls to laugh it off. So this happened routinely, and then often a security guard would come or a teacher would come, somebody that was on duty in the school, having seen it on the bank of video screens, and they'd kind of come running up and say, everything okay here? And the girl would just say, oh yeah, we were just having a laugh, or something like that. There was intense pressure on them not to, as they would characterize it, be a snake, grass the guy up, those kinds of phrases. We were very, very shocked when we heard these kinds of accounts very often, and we needed to check with the young people that it wasn't just, that we weren't getting it wrong, you know, that it wasn't just playing in some sense. Jodie, a 13-year-old, said, we asked, well, is it just play, you know, could it be conceived of as play? And she said, if it's playing, you're like, get off me. If you're playing, you're like, okay, get off me, and they'll let go and you'll both be laughing. But when it's serious, like most of them will all be on you at the same time, like they will be on you at the same time, and you will be like, get off me, and they won't get off you, and that's when it becomes serious. I've kind of talked about this physical, verbal, violent kind of harassment of girls in the school because I think it's so important when we think about sexting that we don't just lift it out and we don't sort of start treating sexting as the problem because it involves digital images or new technology, and in fact it's somehow sexy because it's new technology, because actually it's part of a really, really old and entrenched set of power relations in the school, and that's why I've perhaps laboured this a little bit much, but I want to move on now to speaking more specifically about sexting. So one thing I want to do really is just to kind of suggest that we open up our understanding of sexting. So the kind of typical thing that comes into most people's minds when they hear the word sexting is that image of sexting gone wrong, that idea of the girl who's maybe in a relationship with a boy, sends a sexy picture of herself to him, then the relationship breaks down or something goes wrong, and he, often characterized in a sort of revengeful kind of way, then kind of sends that image around. Clearly that's our kind of like iconic definition of sexting that's circulating in our culture at the moment. But there's so many other forms of sexually explicit messaging. So these are some of the different ones that we kind of listed after talking to young people. Young people didn't, at the time we did this study, didn't even use the word sexting. It wasn't a word that was in their vocabulary. That was a word from the adult world that had been put on to practices that for them were just kind of part of their lives. So a lot of what we might characterize as sexting didn't involve images at all. It was sexy messages. It was the constant messaging to young women to ask them, will you give head? Will you give me a blowjob? Will you have sex with me? Will you do that? Which was utterly relentless. Another thing was about boys having porn on their phones and harassing girls with the porn that they had on their phones. So using it, come and show them an image. Would you do that for me? Would you do that with me? Another thing of tagging images from porn with names from the peer group and then uploading them onto various sites. Asking for sexual acts, sex talk, lots and lots of different forms of sexting. So this is just a kind of typical display picture and profile. And broadcasts, as I mentioned before, the kind of group messaging were really, really important. It wasn't just kind of an individual phenomenon. And I think it's really imperative that we understand some of the pleasurable aspects of this for all the young people, the young women as well as the young men. Girls often talked about enjoying the early stages of a flirtation, being told that they were buff or boom or gifted. I learned a whole new vocabulary doing this piece of research. Being told that they were all those things by a boy, feeling desirable, feeling desired. They also really enjoyed the camaraderie from friends who they said would big them up to boys they liked, saying they were hot or sexy, had a great bum or whatever. But for the girls, many of the communications were marked by quite a realistic sense of defensiveness. So pleasurable flirtation could really easily tip over into harassment. And a striking feature of the research really was the extent to which pleasure and coercion were utterly entangled and blurred, and that's what made this so difficult. For example, requests for a special photo had to be dealt with very, very carefully by girls and very creatively. They knew that just saying an outright no to a boy that was asking them for a special photo would be a mistake. And they talked about how it would be better to come up with plausible reasons why they couldn't, at that particular moment, send a photo, such as they were out of credit on their phone was low on battery. They had such an image, but it wasn't actually on their phone, it was on their computer, and they weren't by their computer at the moment. And we were just amazed and just so impressed with how creative and how resourceful the girls were. They were a conversation analyst's dream study group, actually, for the subtle and sophisticated way that they handled refusals. This is an example of the kind of the entanglement of pleasure and the camaraderie. So this is Mercedes talking about being broadcast about, okay, so what did people say about you when they do a broadcast? They say, stop what you're doing, add Mercedes, she's gifted, that means pretty, and stuff like that. Yeah, stuff like that, she has good conversations. I'm sure they added that bit in for us as researchers, actually. Okay, so is it mainly about your appearance? Yeah, mostly about appearance when it comes to broadcasts. Okay, so tell me exactly what they'd say. If it's a boy and a girl told a boy to BC, that's broadcast their pin, then they'll say, oh, she has big tits and a big bum, and if you get to know her, she's nice. But Mercedes, clearly really kind of relished this. There was definite kind of pleasure and enjoyment of having her friends kind of talk about her in that way. And let's see, this is an example of the creativity. And again, this really, really kind of picks up the pleasurable nature of this kind of sexual communication. He was like, basically he was flirting with me on BBM, and he was like, "You're mad buff, you know." And I was like, "No, I'm not." And he was like, "Yeah, you've got a nice body shape and a pretty face. Now you're just gassing to yourself, which means you're lying." And he's like, "No way." And then he's like, "You're boom," which means you're pretty. And I was like, "No, but thanks," with a kiss face, and he got a hug face. He was like, "Have you got a boyfriend, babes?" I was like, "Yeah, he's a lucky man to have someone as special as you." And I was like, "I'm not special." He was like, "I think you're really special, babes." And I was like, "Oh, thanks," with a hug face. And he was like, "No problem," with a hug face. And then he was like, "Oh, you are so cute." And I was like, "You are random." And he was like, "You're really buff, man," which means pretty. And I was, "I'm not." And he was like, "You are. Can you send me a picture?" And then I was like, "No, I don't have any credit to send you it," and stuff. And then he's like, "Yeah, it's free over BBM." And I was like, "Because I'm on a contract, it costs me money." And he's like, "Okay then, so yeah." Phenomenal. What a phenomenal girl. So creative, so much negotiation going on. And the way that she was translating that for us as researchers was really helpful. So, do you want to link? That was a kind of classic phrase of, do you want to hook up? Do you want to have sex? Do you want to link? And I was like, maybe. And he said, "What would you do if we linked?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Oh, would you give me blows? That means suck my dick." And I was like, "No, not really." And then he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I'm not like that." But he became furious. I ended up deleting him. Like, say, what kind of thing? Like, "Oh, this girl is pissing me off." It's not a joke, because boys get really serious, because they get really angry at the time and say, "Do it. There's nothing to it. Oh, you're pissing me off. I know where you live, you know." And they'll try it in any type of way, even if they don't know you. So I need to sort of move along towards some conclusions. But I want to convey something about the sheer volume of the requests that the young women receive, and the sense of the relentlessness of the pressure on them to send pictures or to agree to take part in sexual acts. And as I was saying before, for the boys, this was very much about a kind of peer culture, and it was a currency for them. So, you know, we could be doing an interview with a young woman, and whilst we were doing the interview, she might get 50 requests coming in from boys. "Will you give me heads? Will you give me a blowjob? Will you do this? Will you?" An incredible volume of messages coming into the girls all the time. Now, at the end of that, if a girl said, "Yeah, okay," which she might say to, "Yes, okay, I'll give you a blowjob," you know, you couldn't help feeling that she'd just been worn down by the relentlessness of the pressure. But then for the boy, I think almost as important as any kind of putative sexual act itself is the fact that he can then take a screenshot of her saying yes, because that screenshot of her saying, "Yes, I will give you a blowjob," is his currency. And what we found was that there was a system of ratings amongst the boys where they could get rated for things like being hard, being tough, being involved in crime, being good looking, having the right kinds of clothes, wearing the right kinds of labels, but above all, for getting some sort of sign of their sexual prowess. And that sign could be images of girls, as we've talked about, with the, you know, "owns me" across their breast. But it could be, you know, just, "Yes, I'll do this for you," or "Yes," you know, some sort of public display or something that could be made public of their kind of sexual prowess. So it was all about kind of homosocial dynamic between the boys. And I just want to say something about how some of the boys felt about that, because they weren't all happy about it by any means. And, you know, a lot of them felt intensely uncomfortable, but they were caught up in this peer culture and the kind of dynamic that would be used to shame them was often a kind of homophobic bullying. So a kind of shaming of, if you don't take part in this, or if you refuse to take part, then there would be the kind of accusation, as they experienced it, that they were gay. And that was kind of the reason that many of them took part in it very reluctantly. So, yeah, I'll just give you some screen munches. I think you see the sort of the currency amongst the young people, but also the kind of way that a putative desire can switch so easily into just, you know, venomous aggression. A girl saying, because if you have my number, you'll text me all the time, so I don't want you to have it. And him replying, I don't want your number in the first place, bitch. So I think this captures this sense of kind of competitiveness amongst the boys. I won't read out the full quote. And also the kind of implicit class dimensions of it, and the idea that if you can get a picture of a girl who wouldn't normally be the kind of girl that would be expected to send a picture, that somehow has more value and therefore gives you more value in the peer network. And this is what I was talking about how difficult it is for the boys to resist. All of this takes place in a context that is absolutely structured by sexual double standards, and this has been something that's been discussed since the 1970s, decades of research in schools consistently showing that girls who have sex or who dress in a particular way are at risk of being labelled sluts or slags in a way that has no parallel for boys. And the difficulty of managing that for the girls. And it was very, very alive and well in the schools where we did our field work. And girls displayed huge anxiety about the possibility of being called a sket, a slut, a slag. They were aware that these epithets were dangerous to them, and they were also aware that there were no equivalent terms for the boys and that the boys could expose them at any moment. So there was such a kind of vigilance about policing their reputations. They were under intense pressure. And I think one of the less visible ways that this impacts this double standard is on the impossibility for the girls to develop a kind of positive sexual subjectivity. I won't say impossibility, but let's say the difficulty for the girls and young women of developing a positive sense of themselves as sexual subjects in the context of this sexual double standard, because what they were forced to do was to adopt a defensive position in relation to sex and sexuality all the time. There was no space for them to explore or articulate their own sexual desires or wishes. And on the very, very few occasions when those desires were articulated, they had to do lots and lots of identity work to say, oh, I'm not a slut, but... And the very definition of sex that was circulating was one that was exclusively defined on heterosexual male terms. The obsession with the blowjob and practices that might prioritise any female pleasure were treated with contempt or derision. So it was very, very hard for the girls to develop a positive sexual identity. And so to conclude, our research has departed from existing studies in significant ways. It's pointed to the need to think about sexting beyond the ubiquitous focus on the selfie. It's highlighted the significance of peer exchanges and surveillance and potential exposure rather than stranger danger. It's tried to highlight the profoundly different ways that men and women are positioned in relation to sexting. And it's highlighted the blurred lines and intimate entanglements between pleasure, risk and coercion. Above all, what we've tried to do is bring a focus on gender to the research, arguing that what is most difficult for the young women are the pernicious and persistent gender inequalities and sexual double standards to which they're subject. So these teen sexting images gain currency as part of a heteronormative visual and cultural economy in gender differentiated ways, and without understanding the persistence of sexism, and I'd add heterosexism as well, we can't really begin to understand the variety of practices of peer-mediated digital communication currently known as sexting. And so I hope that our studies made a small beginning to understanding this. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to thank Ros for a fantastic talk. I think just, you know, the way that you've brought the whole issue of sexism, gender, sexual double standard into the conversation about, you know, what are seen to be modern problems of sexting and, you know, what happens with mobile technology, social media and so on, really how it really sort of arcs back to, as you've said, problems that are sort of much more you know, older problems that are familiar for those of us who have been around for a long time. Ros is happy to answer some questions for a little while, so I think because we're videoing it, I'm going to repeat the questions and then Ros will answer them. Comments, questions? The question was, what's the role of popular culture in relation to these kind of issues and behaviours that Ros has been talking about? In an abbreviated fashion.
Yeah, that's a huge question, and I can't really answer it. I suspect that it's hugely important, and I suspect without our kind of brilliant translators who were translating a lot of kind of young people's language for us, we probably missed loads and loads of really significant popular cultural references that were going on. But, you know, because we weren't attuned to them because we're too old and we're not in that culture, I'm sure we missed them, but I'm sure that it's really, really significant. But can I sort of turn it around in a way and just kind of ask you a question? Because, you know, I kind of talked at length about how shocked we were by what we found in the schools. You know, we're not really easily shocked people, but we were shocked by the kind of levels of sexual violence and sexual harassment in the schools, and we in a way became much more kind of concerned about that than about the kind of mediated stuff that we were talking about. Is that shocking to you, and is that unfamiliar to you here? I'm trying to understand how unique it is to London, or whether it's a more generalised phenomenon in schools.
A teacher from an Auckland school saying that there's been a sort of flurry of fourth form, year 10 boys taking photos up girls' skirts. And then spreading them around, yeah.
And I can see there's another question, but can I just sort of like use your answer in a way to respond to Paulette's question, because I think that's absolutely a brilliant example of something that's totally widespread in, say, paparazzi practice and celebrity magazines of, you know, trying to do those upskirt photos. So a completely routinized sort of thing from popular culture being taken up and used in particular ways in peer networks.
So I guess sort of the question is, while there's an onus on girls to sort of protect themselves and things, you know, that we're currently seeing, Ros is bringing up in her talk, obviously, the pressure that boys are talking about in terms of engaging in some of these practices, even if they don't really agree with it or don't feel comfortable. So what can we do? What was to support or assist boys in resisting these kind of pressures, I guess? I mean, you heard the question, but that's just for the video.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question and really important. And I don't think there's any kind of magic answers aside from creating spaces and forums and just opportunities to actually talk about this stuff all the time in schools, in single-sex groups, in mixed groups. And, you know, sex education in the UK is pretty atrocious. I think most people would agree. It's still really kind of mired in a kind of biological reproductive model. It's still utterly heteronormative. It's, you know, study after study talks about the terrible isolation of being lesbian and gay, let alone being a trans person growing up in a school, 50% of whom have apparently attempted suicide by the time they've reached 18, according to a news study. And there's so much that needs to be done in just you know, talking about this stuff and not being afraid of it and creating spaces where young people can talk, I think.
So the question was whether Ros has noticed any overlap between the kinds of sexual sexting kind of pressures and pressures to have a particular body type.
That's really interesting. I can't say from this actual research, there's nothing that I could kind of pull out, you know, on the top of my head that would kind of illustrate a kind of any kind of causal connection or anything. But it would be kind of so unlikely for it not to be the case somehow. I mean, I guess the thing that came out, which is not surprising given the kinds of images in popular culture perhaps, was around the desirability of the big-breasted, big-bottomed woman, basically. That was, again, but that's also possibly kind of influenced by the kind of ethnic makeup of the school as well. Yeah, I can't totally answer that, sorry, but...
The question, I think, was there's been a big drop in a lot of countries in teen pregnancy, and at the same time a drop in reported rates of engagement in sexual intercourse among young people in New Zealand. And, you know, the question is whether young people are actually, because of all this pressure, possibly, opting out of sex.
Do you know, I'm just going to have to hold my hands up and say I'm really sorry, I can't answer that. It's intriguing, and it's, you know, be fascinating to do some research and also to be comparing, you know, girl-only schools with mixed schools, but I just don't have the answer, sorry.
The question was whether the difference in the way that different schools approach surveillance of the students you know, played out differently in terms of how the kids experience these issues.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question again. I think our sample's probably too small to be able to answer that. But yeah, I think the most striking thing for us was how ineffective the surveillance was in the school that did have greater surveillance. It just wasn't working at all for them because of all those kind of social pressures. So, you know, things were being seen, things were being photographed, but the meaning of those things could be completely reconstructed at a moment's notice, and so it really wasn't effective. I would say also sort of coming sideways onto your question in a way about the pressure that some of the teachers were under in the schools as well. And, you know, like teachers telling us about situations where, you know, we have these kind of electronic whiteboards. It's quite a routine thing in the classroom, where they would go into teach a maths class, say, and find that somebody had got porn running on, you know, on the electronic whiteboard. And the intense pressure, especially for young female teachers who might only be in their early 20s themselves, on how to handle that. You know, what is the right way to deal with something like that? Because you've got to make it, you're in a quite tough inner city school, and the pressure on them as well to laugh things off was intense. Yeah, I think that's a great question. There's so much work to be done, and I certainly don't think sexting is a, you know, exclusively heterosexual kind of thing. It can't be, as you say. You know, it's a totally kind of normal within many gay communities. I think, you know, the moment where we did this research was kind of, you know, it's only 2 years ago, but it already feels like such a lot of time has passed. It was kind of before Grindr was as big as it is. It was kind of before Tinder altogether. So the rate at which things are changing is quite phenomenal. And I know this is, again, going slightly sideways on your question, but I'm just amazed by, in terms of kind of online dating practices, I'm just amazed by the take-up of that even amongst my students right now. So there's so much work to be done. This is like a tiny study of 35 teenagers. So sorry, I can't really say more than that.
The question was there any talk of boys sending photos themselves?
There was. It's funny because we were talking yesterday about kind of sort of reverse sexism and the kind of take-up of discourses of victimization by young men, and sort of like we're all equally objectified now. And that very much did come out in the interviews that we did, that you know, there would be kind of references to, well, look, hey, I've got this picture of my six-pack on Facebook, but it was totally different. It was absolutely different. That was you know, an act of bravado, of sexual showing off, of swagger. It was all those things. It wasn't anything that could be used to shame the boy. You know, there's nothing shaming about, you know, having your six-pack circulated, no image of your torso circulated at all. So just completely different. Yeah.
So the question is, how did the schools react to the research? What happened?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They reacted with shock and with a great kind of hunger to do something. We got kind of suddenly inundated with requests to go and address school governors' meetings, so not just in the actual schools where we carried out the research, but much more widely. Please come and talk to us, because this sense, you know, it wasn't just amongst the young people, this sense of silence, it was amongst everyone, and teachers are so hard pressed, they're so overworked, they're, you know, dealing with so many targets all the time that they have to kind of tick off. They just did not have the space to work around these issues at all. It's to my great sadness and regret that we just didn't get the follow-up funding. You know, I said at the beginning this was meant to be a kind of exploratory pilot, and what we wanted to do was, and the schools wanted us to do this as well, we wanted to go back into the schools and we wanted to work with these young people. We wanted to, you know, work with them to produce materials that they would have liked to see, because there's, you know, so much stuff that is just does not speak to them at all, and we just didn't get the funding. Ah, tragic.
So that was just making the comment about an Instagram account. I didn't catch the name of it.
I think it's called By Philippe.
By Philippe.
Yeah, so BYE Philippe.
So it's about where showing how a response, was it on Tinder, how when, you know, is it a man who's rejected or anybody?
It's just, it's just a collaboration. Basically.
Yeah, and then how that turns into kind of sometimes an aggressive kind of response. In a sense, the sort of thing that Ros was talking about in some of her Facebook interactions. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I hadn't heard of it, but I've just got a PhD student who's literally just about to start, and she's doing her PhD on kind of harassment on Tinder. So I'll definitely be following up on that. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think I'd like to just thank Ros once again for a really sort of thought-provoking talk, I think, in terms of, I think particularly bringing this whole issue of gender and sexism into this conversation about sexting, and the way that I think the message I'm taking out of it is that, you know, really the importance of addressing these sexual double standards and basic sort of old-fashioned you know, gendered abuse really, and gendered power dynamics when we're talking about these kind of new technologies that, you know, as some of us older people are trying to sort of understand. So thank you very much, Ros. I mean, Ros has come all the way from London for 10 days. It's quite a physically punishing regime. She's also talking tomorrow as part of a symposium on body talk with Ginny Brown, Mitch Ong and George Parker. That's on here tomorrow at 1:30 p.m. So if you want to hear more of Ros's work and our colleagues' work, please do come along to that as well. So thank you very much, Ros, for a wonderful talk, and thank you all for coming. Thanks.